Our guest today is a very special person. Our guest is one enns. And I want to start by saying that he served as a member of parliament for Portage Napawa between the years of 1962 and 68. And he has recently celebrated his 90th birthday, so our guest has lived for almost a century. Congratulations to you.
Oh, thank you.
6 of those years were spent in Canadian politics. It was a short but very intense journey into the heart of politics in Canada. And I'm curious to know whether you were always interested in a political career.
No, that's nowhere part of any family history. I had no intention or any expectation that I would ever serve in Parliament. However, because of having moved, when we moved to Portage la Prairie, we happened to land in a house next to the sitting member of Parliament. So that's one incident. And then the president of the Conservative Association was across the street, and his kids and our kids were the same age, so we got to be quite a friendly group. And when the sitting member of Parliament said he wouldn't run again, somebody said, well, why don't you run, Sig? Which Vera, my wife Vera, and I just laughed off to begin with. But then strong pressure persuaded us that we should at least stand for nomination, and that's how it started.
Well, the thing is that at that time, I think Parliament was comprised largely of lawyers and businessmen, and perhaps it's fair to say that it still is. And here you arrived there at the age of 38.
Yes.
And you were a social worker and a very musical person, a Mennonite, and of course you were probably the only guy there who was born in Russia. Now, who was more shocked when you found yourself there, you or Parliament?
Well, Parliament is interesting. It receives new members every session, so that it wasn't unusual to get some nondescript person showing up on a backbench somehow in an election. So I was just one of several others. So, but we talk about the makeup of Parliament. In the Conservative Party, there was only one field member at the time, and Jean Wads. And that's quite singular. That's quite that has changed quite a lot now since then, hasn't it? Yeah.
And what did you say when people kept asking you that question, which is on the record? What's a guy like you doing in politics?
Well, everybody always is critical of government. Oh, the government should have done that, and why did they do this? Well, why, if you ever had a chance to have a seat in Commons, why don't you want to take it then? And that's how I more or less rationalized, well, quit squawking. If you can do something, go ahead and do it. So that's all.
And what was your family life like at the time? What was your life situation when you took up this work?
Well, that's the hardest part, the family, stress on family, because I had been the executive director of the Children's Aid Society, and we were forever inquiring to establish foster homes where neglected children could experience family life. And in various meetings around the what was my future constituency, I was talking about foster families trying to include the foster children as part of their family, especially the fathers. They should also be part of that. So when I got elected in 1962, I thought, well, most Parliament sessions go for about 4 years. We moved our family to Ottawa, a young family to Ottawa. And that was an interesting experience because the session started in September, and in February, that's only 5 months later, the Prime Minister is defeated on the nuclear warhead issues. And so I'm without a job after 5 months. After electioneering and thinking I'd have 4 years, I got 5 months. Well, we moved back to Portage la Prairie, and this is midterm now in February. And first of all, in Ottawa, they were on a 13th grade system. So what is a grade 8 boy of Manitoba? Where does he fit in? So that was barely adjusted, but finally that worked. And then in February, we say, oh, well, we changed our mind. We're going back to Manitoba, you know. So that's just one of those difficulties. But because I had won with such a good majority in my first election, I was persuaded that surely you're going to run again, and I did in 1963.
Now, this was the era of some very colorful, iconic political figures. And I'm thinking here of Pierre Trudeau, of Lester Pearson, Diefenbaker, of course, and Tommy Douglas, who I think arrived at about the same time as you. Do you have any memories of what was your impression of Trudeau, for example?
Well, I see Trudeau is the one that defeated me. It's Trudeau-mania, so I didn't really serve under his term, but he was there when he was Justice Minister, and I sat opposite him in Parliament, especially talking about the Canada Pension Plan. We had discussions, he and I, and also on mainly that issue where I got involved. But talking about Parliament, Tommy Douglas didn't get elected in 1962. He was defeated. Can you believe that? Because in Saskatchewan he had already introduced the Medicare plan, and the doctors had threatened to quit. He had scared the mothers that they wouldn't get service, and they had to hire doctors from England. You might remember that too. So he didn't make it in his own riding, in his own provincial riding. But then some member from Coquitlam in BC resigned to give an opening for him to come in on a by-election. And if a member comes in on a by-election, he gets introduced to the House of Commons by the leader of the party, or a single member, like Stanley Knowles and Bert Herridge from BC. They welcomed him to the House, introduced him to the Speaker, and Mr. Pearson, the Prime Minister, said welcoming words to him, and so did Mr. Diefenbaker, the Leader of Opposition, welcoming him as a new member. And even Robert Thompson, who was then leader of the Social Credit Party, made some welcoming comments. And then Tommy Douglas stood up to reply, and somebody shouted, "Stand up, Tommy!" Well, he's a short man. He said, "Mr. Speaker, I am standing up. In some houses of debate, we are measured from the shoulders up." And that's the kind of thing that Tommy Douglas would be able to do. You know, I admired him a lot. Yeah.
Now, you also had a chance to observe Mike Pearson close up, and of course, John Diefenbaker. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, okay, maybe this is an illustration. My parents came to visit me on my invitation to Ottawa. And so I thought I must introduce him to Mr. Diefenbaker. He's my party leader, right? And Mr. Diefenbaker sitting behind his desk and makes the appropriate welcoming comments and some exchange back and forth. And it talks about me being a good member for the House, which was satisfactory for my father to hear. And anyway, then we go across past where the Prime Minister residence. It's on the second floor there. And Mr. Pearson is walking down the stairs to the chamber. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Pearson," Mr. Prime Minister said, "I would like you to meet my parents, my father, you know." And that man puts his arm around my shoulder, and he's such a good member. He's just with the wrong party. So that illustrates the two different individuals.
Now, I know that you were there on the day that John Kennedy was assassinated. What are your memories of that day in Parliament?
Oh, that was a very difficult day. The House of Commons usually had committee meetings in the morning and didn't start sessions until 10 o'clock in the afternoon, and sat until 10 o'clock at night, you know. So that was generally the weekday. But on Fridays, when members wanted to get home earlier, we had a morning session, and Mr. Pearson starts off, the Prime Minister starts off the session by declaring that Air Canada, or no, it was Trans-Canada Airlines at that time, had purchased a DC-9 jet aircraft for Air Canada. And there had been a competing bid from France. Oh yeah, and the McConnell Douglas company said that if we get the contract, the Canadian industry will build about 40% of their sales section. That means about 4,000 or 5,000 jobs. And the competing airline from France had said the same thing about their airplane. So it wasn't so much the plane that the Prime Minister had in his mind. It means jobs. So he got persuaded. Well, it must have also been a better bid, I guess. So by announcing the choice of airplane, he meant there are 5,000 jobs for Toronto. But that didn't end there. Then the the Test Canada Airline overhaul base, which was in Winnipeg, was going to be moved to Montreal to make up for the fact that they didn't get the job. But meantime, Winnipeg was going to lose a job. And when that happened, Mr. Diefenbaker was straight on his feet. He didn't want to be recognized by the chair. He was pointing to the Prime Minister that the East is shafting the West again. And when the leaders were doing that, you can imagine the noisy backbenchers doing that. I was ashamed to sit there, just back and forth rumbling. I hoped in the valley there was nobody there that would know me, you know. That's the kind of session it was in the morning. And then we adjourned for dinner. And there's a parliamentary restaurant on the 6th floor. It's over the House of Commons. And in that restaurant, if you sit with a table for 4 or 6, you get seated that way. However, if you go alone but don't want to sit alone, both the Liberals and the Tories had an oval table for about 16 members, so there would always be somebody there, you know. And once in a while, the chief would sit at that table. And that morning, he sat at that table. And we were reviewing how Pearson got almost apoplectic over his decision to move the overhaul base from Winnipeg to Montreal, when Diefenbaker's secretary, there was no radio in the restaurant, when Diefenbaker's secretary comes to him just with a message, "The president has been shot." And he just left his table and walked out. And John A. MacDonald, a Liberal, was sitting behind me. What's wrong with the chief? And I said, well, the president had been shot. Well, nobody knew what to do with that. We all knew it was Kennedy. He had been to Ottawa a few months earlier, you know. So we had all seen him. And then we convened the House at 1 o'clock, I guess. We came back for lunch. And Mr. Pearson gets up to announce the terrible tragedy and wishing Godspeed for an early recovery when a page boy was coming along and hands him a note that the president has died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. Well, Mr. Diefenbaker then got up at a time like this, there can be no division in this House. The president belongs to the ages, and all kinds of phrases you wish you could have thought of yourself. And I'm sitting there saying, wait a minute, 2 hours ago I was ashamed to be sitting here. Now I'm witnessing a moment of history. That's what I remember about Kennedy's saying, and that's quite a story, isn't it?
Now, you've used the expression backbencher a couple of times. What is a backbencher for those of us who don't know the little piece?
Well, everybody who's not in the cabinet is a backbencher. So there's, all of us are backbenchers. And we all have pursue our own interests, some of our by the constituency pressure. I have made several motions to establish an education society or a branch of education, because what I had gotten in my correspondence with people, especially we had the Portage the Air Force had a base at Portage, sub-Portage, and they were complaining that they moved a family here and then moved a family there, and then the subject of history, for example, had already been instructed, and then they moved to the new country where they're just repeating it. So I said that education is a sort of it's supposed to, according to the Charter, be an A Act, it's a provincial Christian. But because there's so much federal money going into this, couldn't there be, I wanted to be Department of Health and Education. Now, that was one of my reasons for doing that. And then I had something about the crop insurance. I had a motion for that. And also that, by the way, there was a private member's bill, which I got successful in getting through. And so that's one thing. And then you're also very active in committees. One of the things, I was in a drug committee where we were reviewing the cost of drugs. And we went to Montreal and we visited many chemical factories, and we were amazed at the amount of emphasis was done on safety. But drugs, how long will they stay on the shelf and still be active and so forth? There was a very good education, and because we were shocked about the price of this thing, I made some comments which were quoted in the Globe and Mail and so forth. It was a very good experience for me. I was serving on about 4 standing committees, and this was one of them. Yeah.
So a backbencher has a chance to make a real contribution.
Oh yes, oh yes. Yeah. We never can. No private member's bill gets, not no, very few private member bills get through, except when they're more or less all agreeable. But in addition to that, they also have participation in the House. You have to think of what your responsibility is. You have a responsibility with the constituency. You have the responsibility to participate on the debates of the House floor of the House of Commons, and also in the standing committees. You have to be active in that. So it's quite an engaging occupation.
And in the 6 years that you were there with this oddly unpredictable series of minority governments, what issues were, what was really accomplished? Can you remember things?
Well, yeah, many people have asked about that. Well, there wasn't much done. All minority governments, and the truth, they all were minority governments. However, there were over 52 statutes that had been dealt with and passed. And among them were contentious things like, for example, the flag. Mr. Diefenbaker mounted what do you call it? That word. Protest. We all had to speak. There's a name for this.
We can come back.
Yeah, and that went on. That caused the longest session of Parliament that ever had been held in Canada. We had no summer recess. It was just going on and on.
About the flag?
Mostly about the flag, yeah. So and I had to legitimately, and in my speech, I supported the old flag because I had received the petitions from some legionnaires and had no letters at all supporting the idea that we needed a new flag. And Mr. Pearson actually came to Portage la Prairie during this session, during the debates. And there was a large assembly of legionnaires at that time, and he talked about wanting a new flag, and he was booed. It was a very difficult thing for Prime Minister Pearson to do. And finally, now I'm very proud of the flag, but it was protested long and wide, yeah.
Can we get, in his words, a brief history? Most people don't realize the flag is only 50 years old. It's not really common knowledge for these junior high schools and stuff. It's been around their whole lives, and they don't really get it.
So, what else do we need there?
Well, the fact that it's on an anniversary of the 50th, like on February 15th, is the 50th anniversary of the new flag. And that got some attention across the country, didn't it, just this last weekend. And you're right that many of the next generation never understood the old ensign. But what Mr. Pearson was saying, what the legionnaires were saying, we fought under the red ensign, and we wore that proudly, and why do we need another flag, you see? And there was a lot of discussion. That was a very divisive thing that got passed in these minority situations. And so that's, and then you talked about what other things. Well, the Canada Pension Plan. That is a major legislation that affects the whole country, right? And it only became effective after you have worked for 10, like it was proclaimed in 1966. And you have to have contributed to the pension plan for at least 10 years before you got any benefit. So the person who is 55 and retires at 65, he gets benefits in 5 years. But the kid that's starting at age 18, he has to wait 45 years before he gets any benefit from that. So you couldn't make anything that would fit everybody, but that's why it was so hard to get it through. And in addition to that, we dealt with the divorce laws. Up until then, infidelity was the only legal reason for divorce. But we were able to get in marriage breakdown and these other causes, so that got to be a much more civil act, and that was a major issue too. And in addition to that, the Columbia River Treaty, which Mr. Diefenbaker and President Eisenhower had signed back in the late 50s, had to be renegotiated because BC had not been happy with the treaty. Then Mr. Pearson and Mr. Kennedy signed the revised Columbia River Treaty, which takes that river from BC all the way to U.S. That's why it's a major river that needed attention. So that was also a major thing. And then, of course, we also got the Order of Canada established. That had never been established before. And my father's a recipient of the Order of Canada, for example. And there was also a new labor code. I was amazed to read that this established a minimum wage of $1.25. This is in 1964. And also that it would mean a 40-hour week with 2 weeks vacation after 1 year. That was also got into power then, you know. It's amazing how these things that affected our life here in this country, these were dealt with in these minority governments, you know.
People take them for granted, not really understanding the battle and the back and forth.
Oh yes, oh yeah.
That it took to achieve them.
Yes, right.
Now, on that note, I know that you were able to see the political process, not just the way it's reported in the media or textbooks, but you knew how things actually happened, and I'd like to tell us what you know about the relationships between Canada and China at the time.
Oh,
that
yeah.
was a very hot topic. Tell us what you learned.
Well,
about that.
Canada, of course, wants to market its wheat, so they're always looking for customers to sell wheat. And there had been some expectation that why not deal with China, that it could use this something. However, there was a lot of reluctance because we would have to deal with a communist country, not just selling wheat, but also granting credit to a communist country. So the Diefenbaker, this happened in the Diefenbaker cabinet in 1962. And what was I going to say? Yeah, and the cabinet struggled with this issue, and had their cabinet meeting in Parliament Hill, and also 24 Sussex, because it had to be reviewed. Diefenbaker was so unsure about it. Finally, they agreed. Okay, Alvin Hamilton, the Minister of Agriculture, will go to China, make a deal. And so Alvin Hamilton takes off and goes to China, but on the way he has to change planes in Vancouver. And on the Vancouver airport, a call comes to cancel the deal, don't go. Charlie Orchard was his not aide-de-camp, his executive assistant. He tells the minister the call from Diefenbaker not to go. And then Diefenbaker says, let's just say we didn't get your call, and he went anyway. And then Mr. Diefenbaker, after it was done, and Diefenbaker takes full credit. Oh, I sold the wheat to China. Those are interesting things.
We need to do this story again, because I think, you wouldn't catch this, Jeffrey, but you were talking about, it was Hamilton who said, let's go anyway, right?
Yes,
and
yeah.
You said Diefenbaker.
No, oh yeah, no. No, I think I said Diefenbaker then later on took credit.
Oh, well, now that I've interrupted you, would you mind telling that story again?
Yeah,
it's such a
well, at the airport, Roger Ferguson gets a call to stop, tell the minister that it's off, we shouldn't go. And Mr. Hamilton, the minister, was scheduled to go, he said, let's just say we didn't get that call. And he goes and makes the deal. And after it was successfully applauded by the rest of the country, then Diefenbaker took full credit for having sold wheat to China. So, but I understand the leader's situation, because there was a lot of broad spread reluctance about dealing with a communist country, you know. So, yeah.
Decisions can be made in ways that would surprise us.
Well, yeah, I had a question. Like, you can have questions on the House for any minister you want to talk to, but there are some questions that you don't expect the minister to have answers for. That you put them on the order paper. So all members had received a report of the CBC. And you read that one of the main reason of CBC is to foster national unity. That's applauded. And another one of the top reasons is to stimulate and encourage Canadian talent. And my brother Henry, who had done some work on local CBC work here, had his TV concert cancelled. And there was a Jackson's, the noon hour trade family show was cancelled. And so I wrote a letter after having received the report, how many programs come on the CBC that don't originate in Toronto? Like how many come from the West Coast? How many come from the West Coast? Musical or dramas, not religious, you know, these kind of programs. Well, so I put that on the order paper, and then the vice president of the CBC phones me to say, you know what, we don't keep statistics quite the way you asked them. Is it okay if we answer it this way, you know? And I said, yeah, all I wanted to show is that Toronto generates most of the program. And where's the fostering of Canadian talent? You know, how is that? That was my point, you see. Well, he says, you know what? I'm due on vacation now for the next 10 days, so I won't really get that answer to you until... I said, well, it's not urgent. I understand, you know. So I'm sitting there, and suddenly Mr. Diefenbaker gets up and he says, the member from Portage-Neepawa has a question to the minister about from the CBC, and why hasn't it been answered, you know? And what's going on? So after the question period, we go behind the door, and I says, Chief, I talked to the vice president of CBC, and he will explain what it is. No, he tells me, you got to get right after they make the minister feel uncomfortable, you know. Well, I don't want to play that kind of a game, so I just walked away. These are some other, well, so many things we could talk about, but that's, that's how it works.
So after 6 years and participating in all these, you know, very significant issues and feeling like a bit of a stranger a lot of the time, I'm sure, you were very narrowly defeated. And I'm wondering how that felt.
Well, you mentioned my age, and that means we have a young family. We have four children. Our daughter Kathy, she's still a preschooler, and the others were in a 13-grade system in Ontario. And when I got defeated after only 5 months, we came back to the Manitoba system. And then after in the '63 election, my wife Vera decided, well, we'll just stay in Portage-la-Prairie, and then I would go to Ottawa, come back on weekends, you see. And then having had, that was my fourth election, right? We were Main Streeting Neepawa and McGregor and Crickfield Park. And our party started, or the constituency started just west of Grace Hospital here in Winnipeg, so I had quite an urban area in night riding. And the stress of family life, we were pleased to be defeated. That was better than resigning, because now the constituency, and it was a very, very narrow vote. It was almost the equivalent of 1 vote per poll. David Orlico, my NDP colleague, told me this, that's how narrow the defeat was. But I'm very glad to have had the parliamentary experience, because, as you already indicated, having born in Rushnaya, Russia, starting a very difficult immigrant family on the farm here in Manitoba, to that child being able to claim a seat in the Canadian House of Commons satisfied my sense of history very much.
3 times.
Yes. Well,
would you recommend to young people now there is a kind of cynicism and indifference to political life, particularly national political life, what would you say to a young person who still feels inclined toward making a political contribution?
Well, I'm disappointed that that is the attitude of so many of our younger people. But when you think of the almost childlike behavior that we witness in the House of Commons so often, when in my first speech to the House, I talk about how impressed as a newcomer I am about the beginning of Parliament, how the Governor-General comes in a horse-drawn carriage and the troops are all expected into, and it's wonderful tradition, and the Speaker comes in with his own guide, and the gentleman carries the mace in, and they said, why can't that kind of behavior be amongst all of us who are witnesses? Why are we shouting at each other? Like I told you when Mr. Pearson talked about the Montreal, Canada, where I felt ashamed to be part of it, and that is still going on. So I don't blame people. They don't even watch many people don't watch the news. They have their little computers and their phones, and so they're not involved. You know, and I deplore that. I think Parliament is a talk shop. You know, even if we can't say that Parliament does everything in the country. No, the various departments and the civil servants, they will keep doing what they have to do. And just because we delay a flag debate for 6 months doesn't mean that nothing else is happening in the country. No, the guy at the border is still going to collect your tax at the border, even if the Parliament isn't doing anything. You know, so that's a very interesting way of looking at things. Yeah.
So I think it's safe to say you would do it all again.
Well, now, especially at an older age, without the family relations, that's the hardest part for MPs, I think, especially for younger MPs. I mean, you know, many of the colleagues would already be in their 50s and 60s when I served. So now, when I go to members of the former parliamentarians, and this button lets me into this session, people I served with are not. I don't go there for the meeting of my colleagues that I served with. I go there because it's that sense of history of this kid having been born in Russia, that being able to have an entrance to the House of Commons.
What's our time, Jeff?
We've been shooting for about a half an hour.
Oh dear.
Half an hour?
Yep.
Oh, that's very good.
It's gone by quickly.
Yeah.
Well, very quickly, but that's very good. We've covered a lot.
Well, then that's enough, I guess.
Well, but you know what? I realized something that we at least I skipped right over, and I want to go back, and I'm sure we can easily patch it in, is that after we talked about we didn't actually get into your family background and how you know, the question I should ask you is just how unlikely was the beginning of all of this?
Well, it was total. Yeah, we did that.
Well, no, we didn't do it in detail. We didn't. You touched on it at the end when you were contrasting that beginning with where you went. But it should be at the beginning that where you were born and what your family was like,
yeah.
You know, and that sort of thing.
I was curious as you were speaking as to when you emigrated to Canada, and
well,
I didn't get that.
You see, I was born in 1924. Lenin died in January of 1924, and then Stalin and Trotsky, and there was a big fight about the succeeding leadership. And then by 1925, he was beginning his 5-year plan. And his big thing was to industrialize Canada. There was a peasant landscape pretty well in Russia, and he was disturbed that he wasn't meeting the other countries industrially. So no one owned anything anymore. You had a farm, no, it's all going to be a collective. And you, the farmer, are going to work on this collective. And farmers wouldn't want to do that. In the meantime, to get that point across, they actually starved the people. You know, can I?
And start about the post-revolutionary stuff and Stalin and what he was up to, and leading up to why you left. So
and especially the Mennonites. The Mennonites had.
Wait. We'll get it on tape. So I'll ask the question and start the answer all over again. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I'll just have to edit.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Your origins were very unlikely. Anybody looking at the beginning of your life would find it a little unusual that it took the path that it did. Oh, Where and when were you born, and what circumstances brought you to Canada?
Well, I was born in 1924, and that's 4 years, well, several years after the Russian Revolution, the big Bolshevik takeover. And Stalin, Trotsky, Lenin had died in January of 1924, and no, 1924. And then there was a big friction over leadership succession with Trotsky, and there were three people, and Stalin fighting for it, and Stalin took over. And he wanted to industrialize the country because it was pretty well a peasant state. And farmers were used to deciding when they should sow and when they should harvest, and they did very well for themselves. And especially in the Mennonite colonies, who had been coming there by invitation of Catherine the Great back in the 1800s. And they were established flourishing communities on their own terms, you see. But that was all destroyed because the state owned everything. It's not your house anymore. If they would have come here, they would come in here and say, oh, well, one family can be here, one family could be there, you know. And it was, who would do this? It would be some revolutionary who now had been some kind of official in a village. Well, you're the mayor of this town. Whatever you say, make them do it. And the people were being robbed and killed. It was a terrible time for the country. And because there was such reluctance to give up your own farm and work in a collective, they would say that they would want ever more quotas to be delivered of grain. And finally, they even took a grain that was meant for seed for next year to be delivered, and then they had no seed, and that's why so many people starved in Russia, you know. That was terrible. So then the Mennonite Central Committee had a board here in Canada to offer immigration, and that's how we got to Canada, through the efforts of the Mennonite Central Committee.
And you were how old when you got here?
I was 1 year old. Okay, this was 1925. I was born in April of 24, and we came in June of 1925, just a little over a year old. Some say I might have learned to walk on the ship, but I can't claim that.
Oh, yes, and you arrived where?
I actually meant where he was born. We didn't say.
Oh, right, we didn't say that, yes.
We have it implied, but we haven't had it from his lips.
Which town were you born in?
In Russia? Well, it was in southern Russia, near Halbstadt. It's a Mennonite colony, and that's near Zaporozhye, and not far from Odessa, not too far from the Black Sea there, in that area.
And did your family begin farming here?
Well, my father was a teacher, my mother was a teacher, and a minister. He was no farmer, but Canada said, you can come to Canada, but we want you to spend 5 years on the farm. We don't want you to take jobs from Canadians, so it's on the farm. So then the committee, the Mennonite Central Committee, arranged for where is there land available here, wherever there's land. So Father got, on Mennonite terms, a quarter section of land, with no down payment. He got 6 horses and 6 cows and some pigs and so forth, and some horse-drawn implements because there was no car, and that's how we started. And then we didn't come to Winnipeg until 1932, I guess. All my schooling has been in Winnipeg.
Now, there's one other question that I didn't ask, which I will ask you now, and that is, what was your constituency? What was Portage-Neepawa like at the time that you were representing?
Well, the interesting thing is, I'm the only Mennonite. I was the only Mennonite. There's no real strong Mennonite community anywhere in the Portage-Neepawa constituency. So it wasn't an ethnic support that got me in. It was generally being an acceptable candidate, I guess. And so I smiled a lot and talked good things, and somehow.
And this was a mixed urban and country riding.
Well, yeah, the urban part was like Crickfield Park, and starting at School Road, you know, that's west of Grace Hospital there. And I did fairly well there too. I won almost all of the polls in the rest of the constituency, except there where I wasn't always the leader in the polls. But and in 1963 and in 65 election, even though there were 4 other candidates, my total votes were higher than the other 4 combined. So it was a clear majority for. That was so satisfactory for me to have that experience. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I think we have got through all our questions.
Well, I wanted to close with my evenings.
Yes, you did, and you didn't. So you want to do that now?
Well, does it?
The question that I asked was, is it safe to say that you would do it all again? And so, would that be an opening for you to end the way you want to?
Well, not at my age now, like you say, already over 90 years old. But someone has said that one must wait until evening to know how splendid the day has been. And in spite of hardships and family life and difficulties and so forth, keeping in mind my various work opportunities and my educational standing and so forth, but especially my wonderful family and my 7 above average grandchildren, I can certainly declare that the day has been splendid indeed. How's that?
Very good. You did that.
Okay.
So I think that we covered everything. What's our total tape time?
Oh, I think we did about 40 minutes of material.
Well, that's too much. That's enough, yeah.
That's, and boy, we sure did travel from this to that to the other.
Well.
And I think Jeffrey, I think that SIG actually takes us back, you know, into that time.
Yeah.
With those personalities and those issues.
Did you ever, did you want him to give his full name, or like, you know, the name is?
Yeah, no, they'll give my full name, Siegfried, yeah.
I introduced you as just Sig.
Sig. Yeah, I was always called Sig, but I'm so impressed that in that revolutionary Russia, my father comes with this classical Wagnerian name, Siegfried. You know, there's an opera named Siegfried, and I've been to the town where his opera is. There's a Siegfried, a street named Siegfried. So I'm totally impressed with my parents coming up with a name like that. I've got brothers that are John and Harry and Ernie, you know, and here I am, Siegfried. I'm one of 5 brothers.
Good. Good.
That's great stuff.
That's great. Yeah, the only thing that I didn't get in was the
post political, like I was a hospital CEO and.
Yeah, but really people are more interested in your career.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then we leave that. Yeah.
So I think we're okay.
Well, let's call it a day.
Wow, that's good. Now what we need to do is collect some
If you don't mind, I can take pictures of. Can I?
Yeah, you take. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. Take.
Of course, this fellow. We need that picture.
You think so? Okay.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's striking.
Well, see, I'm wearing a tie there too.
Yeah. Okay.
What's
So
the water there?
Oh,
I'll collect those shots. So, Mom, I'm going to need a little bit of time to just.
okay, is there
take
any
a picture of
coffee
that,
left?
take a picture
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, I need to pack up my gear, so I'll be a little bit here before.
Okay.
Okay.
You've got too much there.
Well, it's going to be a tough edit because it's so interesting. That's the